Channel, Embered Histories. Voice, ENGB Ryan Neural -10%. Format, Longform 2H. Sources: Mark van der Meerup, A History of the Ancient Near East, Blackwell. Medinet Habu Temple Inscriptions of Rameses III, Epigraphic Survey, Oriental Institute. David Kaniewski et al., Paleoclimate and Pollen Studies, Cyprus and the Levant. Carol Bell, The Evolution of Long-Distance Trading Relationships Across the LBA's Iron Age Transition. Uluburun Shipwreck Excavation Reports, Semmelpaluk, Institute of Nautical Archaeology. The city of Ugarit had stood for nearly 2,000 years. It had watched empires rise on every horizon and outlived most of them. Its harbor was crowded with ships from a dozen kingdoms. Its scribes wrote in 7 languages. Its warehouses were heavy with copper and tin and oil and grain. And then, one season near the end of the 13th century before Christ, a scribe sat in a small chamber pressing wet clay with a stylus, writing a letter that would never be sent. He wrote that the enemy's ships had come. He wrote that the city's own fleet was away, somewhere off the coast of a distant land, and that the soldiers were gone too. He wrote that the country was undefended, and he asked the man he was writing to a simple, desperate question. What should we do? The tablet was set near a kiln to be baked hard for the journey. The journey never happened. The kiln, and the room, and the palace around it, all burned in the same fire. And so the letter survived precisely because the city died, hardened in the heat of its own destruction, waiting 3,000 years for someone to read the last words of a man who already knew he was finished. He never learned the answer to his question. Neither, in any complete sense, have we. Because Ugarit was not alone. Within the span of a single human lifetime, perhaps 50 years, every great power of the Eastern Mediterranean fell silent. Not one of them. All of them. At once. And nobody, to this day, can tell you exactly why. Let me take you back to the world before the fire, so you can understand the size of what was lost. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean around the year 1200 before our era. This was not a scattering of mud villages and isolated tribes. This was a connected, sophisticated, international world, more interconnected than anything that would exist again for thousands of years. There were great kingdoms, and they all knew each other. They wrote to each other. The kings called each other brother. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty sat in palaces of stone that had already been ancient when their grandfathers were young, ruling a kingdom that had endured for more than 1,000 years. To the north, in the highlands of what is now Turkey, the Hittites ruled an empire as large and as feared as Egypt itself, a kingdom of iron-grey mountains and walled cities and a king who styled himself My Sunday. On the islands and shores of the Aegean, the Mycenaean Greeks built fortresses of stone so massive that later Greeks believed only giants could have raised them. On the great island of Cyprus, the copper flowed out by the ton, the metal that gave the whole age its name. And along the coast of the Levant, the trading cities, Ugarit chief among them, grew fat on the rivers of goods that flowed between all of these powers. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, a golden age. It was prosperous. It was learned. It felt, to the people living inside it, permanent. Let us put names and faces to it, because it is easy to speak of civilizations and empires and forget that these were people, no different from us in the ways that matter. There was, in those years, a man who sat on the throne of Egypt and called himself the living embodiment of a god. There was a great king in the mountains of Anatolia who believed his line would rule forever. There were merchants in Ugarit who kept careful accounts and worried about their daughters' marriages and the price of grain. There were warlords in the stone fortresses of Greece who drank from cups of gold and listened to bards sing of glory. There were farmers everywhere, the vast silent majority, who rose before dawn and worked the soil and prayed to the gods of rain and harvest, and whose names not one of us will ever know. They had families. They had ambitions and fears and small daily joys. They fell in love and buried their parents and watched their children grow. They argued about politics and complained about taxes and gossiped about their neighbors. They believed, as people always believe, that the world they lived in was the real and permanent world, that tomorrow would be much like today, that the great structures around them, the kingdoms and the trade routes and the gods, were simply the way things were and always would be. None of them woke up one morning knowing that they lived at the end of an age. The collapse, when it came, did not announce itself with trumpets. It came the way most catastrophes come, gradually and then suddenly, as a series of bad years that turned, almost without anyone noticing the moment of turning, into the end of the world. And here is the thing you have to understand if you are going to feel the weight of what happened next. These civilizations were not primitive. They were not stumbling in the dark. They had standing armies and chariot corps. They had diplomats and treaties and an international postal system carried on the backs of donkeys and the hulls of ships. They had writing, accounting, mathematics, astronomy. They had monumental architecture that still stands today. They had economies built on specialization and trade, where a man in one city might spend his whole life making one kind of thing, trusting that the system would bring him everything else he needed from 100 miles away or 1,000. They had, in other words, built something complex. Something that worked. Something that, if you had walked its streets, you would have assumed would last forever. People always assume that. And then, in the space of 2 generations, all of it came apart. The palaces burned. The cities emptied. The writing stopped, in some places for 400 years. The trade routes went quiet. The kings vanished, and in many regions there would be no kings again for centuries. An entire world simply ended. The question that has haunted historians for more than a century is the one that scribe Inu Garrett was really asking, underneath his words about ships and soldiers. What is happening to us? And the honest answer, even now, is that we are still not sure. There is a word for the kind of world they had built, and it is a word worth holding on to, because it explains both the glory of the Bronze Age and the swiftness of its ruin. The word is interdependence. No kingdom in this world stood alone. No king could provide for his own people from his own land alone. Egypt had grain in abundance but craved the cedar timber of Lebanon and the copper of Cyprus and the silver of Anatolia. The Hittites had warriors and iron and mountains but could not feed themselves in a bad year. The Mycenaeans had olive oil and fine pottery and fierce fighting men but needed the tin that came from the far side of the world. Each was strong, and each was incomplete, and each depended on the others to fill the gaps in its own provision. So they wove themselves together, by treaty and by trade and by marriage, princesses sent from one court to another to seal alliances, gifts exchanged between kings on a scale that staggers the imagination, gold and lapis lazuli and ivory and exotic animals passed back and forth across thousands of miles as tokens of brotherhood. It was a system of breathtaking sophistication. And it worked, for centuries, so smoothly that the people inside it could not imagine it ever stopping. They had no memory of a world without it. To them, the international order was simply how things were, as fixed and eternal as the rising of the sun. We know now that it was nothing of the kind. We know now that it was a structure, a thing that human beings had built, and that anything built by human beings can come apart. But they did not know that. And that, perhaps, is the most human part of the whole tragedy. They could not see the cliff because they were standing on top of it, looking out at a view that had never once, in all the generations they could remember, given them any reason to be afraid. So let us go back to Ugarit, because Ugarit is where the collapse speaks to us most clearly, in its own voice, through its own letters. The city sat on the coast of northern Syria, near the modern town of Latakia, on a low mound beside the sea. Today it is called Ras Shamra, the Cape of Fennel. In its time it was one of the richest cities in the world, the great clearing house of the eastern Mediterranean, the place where the goods of Egypt and the Hittites and Cyprus and the Aegean all changed hands. Ships from everywhere put in at its harbor. Caravans came down from the inland kingdoms. The king of Ugarit was not a great conqueror. He was something more useful and more profitable. He was a middleman, a vassal who paid tribute to the mighty Hittite king to the north and kept the wealth flowing, and in exchange he was left alone to grow rich. His palace had some 90 rooms. It had its own archive, libraries of clay tablets recording everything from grand treaties between kings down to the price of a jar of oil and the dowry of a merchant's daughter. The people of Ugarit were so practical, so commercial, so cosmopolitan that they did something almost no one else in the Bronze Age had done. They simplified their writing. Instead of the hundreds of cuneiform signs used elsewhere, the scribes of Ugarit reduced their everyday script to around 30 signs. An alphabet. One of the very first true alphabets in human history, born not from poetry or priesthood but from the sheer need of busy merchants to write things down quickly. That was Ugarit. Clever, wealthy, ancient, and utterly confident in the world it had helped to build. To stand in the ruins of Ugarit today is to stand in a place that knew it was important. The streets were paved. The houses of the wealthy had bathrooms and drainage, plumbing that would not be matched in much of the world for thousands of years. There were temples on the high ground, dedicated to gods whose names we can still read: Bull the storm god who rode the clouds and brought the rain, and El the old father of the gods, and the goddess of love and war. There was a temple to Dagon, the grain god, which tells you everything about what mattered to a people who lived and died by the harvest. The libraries of Ugarit have given us some of the oldest written literature in the world outside Mesopotamia, myths and legends of these very gods, the stories the people of the city told themselves about how the world was made and how it was ruled. They believed Bull had defeated the chaos of the sea, the god Yam, the roaring water, and had imposed order upon it. There is a dark irony in that, when you remember how the city actually died, with enemy ships coming out of that very sea, the chaos the storm god was supposed to have tamed returning, at the end, to claim the city that had honored him. The people of Ugarit had a story for everything except the one thing that finally happened to them. They had no myth for the end of the world. Almost no one ever does. And then the letters change. If you read through the Ugarit archive, you can almost feel the temperature dropping. The early tablets are the correspondence of a thriving kingdom, full of trade and marriage and minor squabbles. But the last batch, the ones from the final years, carry a different tone entirely. There is a letter from the king of Ugarit, written in alarm, asking another ruler for help, telling him that ships, enemy ships, have been sighted, that they have already burned towns and done terrible damage. There is a reply, fragmentary and grim, confirming that the writer's own cities have been attacked, that his own ships are out at sea and cannot defend him. There is the letter I told you about at the start, the one where the king explains that his army is in the land of the Hittites and his navy is off the coast of another country, and the kingdom is naked, and the enemy is here. And there is a letter, found face down in the ruins, never sent, that historians have read with a particular chill. In it the writer pleads for grain to be sent quickly, for the people are starving, and ends with a line that reads almost like an epitaph. It is a matter of life or death. These are not the words of a strong kingdom managing a border raid. These are the words of people who can feel the ground giving way beneath them and do not understand why. And then the letters stop. Forever. There are no tablets describing the fall of Ugarit, because the fall of Ugarit was the moment there was no longer anyone to write. The next thing in the record is the layer of ash. And here is a detail that lingers in the mind long after the rest. Among the ruins of Ugarit, archaeologists found a sword, a fine bronze weapon, inscribed with the name of a pharaoh of Egypt. It was a royal gift, the kind of treasure that passed between courts as a token of friendship and prestige, and it had ended up in this far northern city, lying in the ash of the final destruction. There is a whole vanished world in that single object. It speaks of the connections that bound the kingdoms together, the gifts and the diplomacy, the sense that these powers, for all their rivalries, belonged to a single civilized order and recognized one another as equals. And it speaks of the end of that order, lying there in the burned ruin, the sword of one great king abandoned in the death of another great city, both of them soon to be swept into the same darkness. The objects the dead leave behind have a way of telling the truth more honestly than any inscription. A king might carve a triumph onto a temple wall and lie about it, exaggerate his victories, hide his defeats. But a sword lying in the ash does not lie. It simply says, "Here, something ended. Here was a world that valued such things, that exchanged them between its mightiest rulers, and here is where that world came to its close." When you hold such an object in your mind, the abstraction of the collapse becomes suddenly, painfully real. It happened to particular people, in particular places, on particular days, and it left particular things behind, lying where they fell, waiting in the dark. When the archaeologists dug down through that mound on the Syrian coast, what they found told the rest of the story in silence. A layer of destruction half a meter thick in places. Collapsed walls. Burned beams. Bronze arrowheads lying where they fell. And bodies, in some places, left where they died, with no one remaining to bury them, which in the ancient world was a horror almost beyond words. The city was not just defeated. It was abandoned. Whoever survived the fire did not come back to rebuild on the old stones. Ugarit, after nearly 2 millennia, simply ceased. The trade ended. The harbor silted. The alphabet those clever merchants had invented was carried off by others, by the Phoenicians a little way down the coast, who would pass it on to the Greeks, who would pass it on, eventually, to us. The very letters you are reading these words in are the great-great-grandchildren of the script that died with Ugarit. But the city itself never rose again. And here is the question that the ruins press upon you, standing in that ash. Who did this? The letters speak of ships and of an enemy from the sea, but they never quite say who. And Ugarit was only the beginning. Because to the north, the mightiest empire of the age was about to do something even stranger than burn. It was about to disappear without leaving so much as a single arrowhead to tell us how. The Hittites. Even the name has faded from common memory, which is itself a kind of testimony to how completely they vanished. For the better part of 2 centuries, this was one of the 2 great superpowers of the known world, the equal of Egypt, feared from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. Their heartland was the high central plateau of Anatolia, the rugged interior of modern Turkey, a hard country of cold winters and stony soil. From there they had built an empire that stretched across most of Asia Minor and reached down into Syria, swallowing kingdoms, breaking armies. They fought the Egyptians to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles ever recorded, and afterwards the 2 superpowers signed the oldest surviving peace treaty in the world, a treaty so dignified that a copy of it hangs today on the wall of the United Nations. The Hittite king did not bow to anyone. He called himself the Great King, the Sun. His capital, Hattusa, was a fortress city in the mountains, ringed by walls miles long, studded with gate towers carved into the shapes of lions and sphinxes, a city built to overawe and to endure. The Hittites had iron when iron was still rare and precious. They had a complex law code, a pantheon of 1,000 gods, an archive of treaties and prayers and the rituals of kingship. They were, in every sense, a great power. And then they were gone. Not conquered in a single famous battle. Not absorbed into a rival empire. Simply gone, so thoroughly that for most of recorded history nobody even remembered they had existed. The Bible mentions Hittites in passing, and for centuries scholars assumed these were some small obscure tribe. It was not until the 19th and early 20th centuries that the ruins of Hattusa gave up their archives and the world rediscovered an empire it had completely forgotten. How does that happen? How does a superpower fall so hard that history forgets it was ever there at all? To understand how strange the Hittite disappearance is, you have to understand how solid they seemed. This was not a flimsy kingdom. The Hittites had a developed legal system, with laws covering everything from murder to theft to the price of a slave, laws that were in many ways more humane than those of their neighbors, preferring fines and compensation to the brutal mutilations favored elsewhere. They had a vast religious life, worshipping what they themselves called the 1,000 gods of Hatti, gathering up the deities of every people they conquered and adding them to their own crowded pantheon rather than stamping them out. They had a diplomatic service of remarkable subtlety, and the archives of Hattusa are full of letters between the great king and his vassals and his rivals, full of flattery and threat and careful negotiation, the ordinary business of running an empire that stretched across mountains and deserts. They had married into the Egyptian royal family, sending a Hittite princess to become a wife of the great Rameses II himself, sealing the peace between the two superpowers with a bond of blood. They had been, in short, one of the fixed points of the world, a power that had existed for as long as anyone could remember and that gave every appearance of existing forever. When you read the confident, formal, bureaucratic language of the Hittite court at its height, the language of an empire utterly sure of its own permanence, and then you remember that within a few generations there would be nothing left, not even a memory, the effect is genuinely vertiginous. It is like reading the minutes of a meeting in a building that you know is about to be swallowed by the earth. The last decades of the Hittite Empire read, in retrospect, like a man growing ill before he dies. The signs are there if you know to look for them. There are letters, urgent ones, about grain. The Hittite heartland, that high stony plateau, could never feed itself comfortably, and in good years the empire imported food, grain shipped in by sea from Egypt and from Canaan, brought up through the ports of the Levant. In the final years those letters take on a frantic edge. One Hittite king writes about a matter of life and death, demanding that ships be sent with grain, urgently, as though the survival of the realm depended on the next harvest somewhere far away. And it may well have. Because an empire that cannot feed itself is an empire balanced on a knife, and the knife was the long thin chain of ships and roads that brought the food in. Cut that chain in enough places and the great king on his throne in the mountains starves no differently than a peasant. There were other troubles too. Rebellious vassals on the edges. Pressure from peoples to the west and north whose names flicker in and out of the Hittite records like shadows at the edge of a fire. A dynasty that had spent generations fighting to hold itself together, riven by usurpations and family murder. The empire was not healthy when the crisis came. It was already straining. And then something pushed, and it did not bend. It shattered. When the archaeologists came to Hattusa, the great Hittite capital in the mountains, they expected, perhaps, to find a final battle. A last desperate defense, walls breached, a city stormed and put to the torch by some triumphant enemy. What they found was stranger and, in its way, far more unsettling. The city had burned, yes. But the more carefully they looked, the more it seemed that when the fire came, the city was already largely empty. The royal archives, the precious tablets, many of the valuables, the things a fleeing court would carry away or a conquering army would loot, were simply not there in the quantities you would expect. The grain stores had been emptied beforehand. It looked, more and more, less like a city overrun and more like a city abandoned. As though the king and the court and the army and the gods themselves had packed up and walked away, taking what they could, leaving the great walls and the carved lion gate standing empty behind them. And then, perhaps later, perhaps much later, someone, or no one in particular, set fire to what was left. The capital of one of the two greatest empires on earth was not conquered. It was deserted. The great king, the sun, simply left, and we do not know where he went, and we do not know why, and we never hear from him again. Imagine the silence of that. Imagine walking those abandoned streets, the wind moving through halls where the language of 1,000 gods had been spoken, the throne cold, the granaries bare, the whole apparatus of a superpower folded up and carried off into a darkness from which it never returned. Whatever frightened the Hittites enough to abandon their own untaken capital, we have no clear name for it. But the same shadow that fell across Syria and across Anatolia was already crossing the sea, towards the islands and shores of the Greeks. And there, the destruction would wear a different face. Not abandonment. Annihilation. And consider what it would have meant, in human terms, to be a Hittite in those final years. Imagine you are born in a city of the empire, raised to believe in the eternal greatness of the sun, the great king in his mountain capital, the gods of Hatti who guard the land. You have known nothing but the order of the empire your whole life, the tax collectors and the soldiers and the priests, the grain that comes in from the coast in the lean months, the roads that bind the kingdom together. And then, in the space of a few years, it begins to fail. The grain ships stop coming, or come less often, and the price of bread climbs, and there are stories of famine in the provinces. The soldiers are called away to deal with troubles on the frontiers, troubles that never quite get resolved, that keep flaring up in new places. There are refugees on the roads, people from somewhere else, somewhere that has already fallen, telling frightening stories. And then one day the unthinkable happens. The court itself, the king himself, packs up and leaves the capital, and you watch the great apparatus of the only world you have ever known simply dissolve, the soldiers gone, the officials gone, the king gone, the gods seemingly silent. What do you do? Where do you go? The Hittite Empire did not leave us the diaries of ordinary people, only the formal records of kings, and so we can never know exactly what those last frightened citizens felt. But we can imagine it, because it is one of the oldest human fears, the fear that the structure holding up your whole life is not as solid as you were promised, that one day you will wake up and the order of the world will simply be gone. For the Hittites, that fear came true. Cross the water now, westward, to the Aegean, to the world of the Mycenaeans. These were the Greeks of the Bronze Age, the people who, centuries later, would be remembered in the poems of Homer as the heroes who sailed to Troy. Agamemnon, Achilles, Menelaus, the kings of golden Mycenae and sandy Pylos and high-walled Tiryns. Whether any of those particular men ever lived we cannot say, but the world Homer half remembered was real, and it was the world of these people. The Mycenaeans were warriors and traders and builders. They took their early civilization from the Minoans of Crete and then surpassed and absorbed them. They built citadels on hilltops across the Greek mainland, fortresses of stone so colossal that the Greeks of the classical age, looking up at the ruins, could not believe human hands had made them and decided that the one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes, must have stacked those boulders. We still call that style of masonry Cyclopean. At Mycenae itself you can walk, even now, through the Lion Gate, beneath two great carved beasts that have guarded that threshold for more than 3,000 years. Behind those walls the Mycenaean lords lived in palaces decorated with frescoes, drank from cups of gold, kept meticulous records on clay tablets in a script we call Linear B, an early form of Greek. They ran complex palace economies, tracking flocks and grain and bronze and the labor of women who spun and wove. They traded across the whole Mediterranean. They were rich, and they were strong, and their fortresses were built to laugh at any attacker. And yet, the Linear B tablets, like the letters of Ugarit, grow tense in the final years, if you know how to read them. At Pylos, in the southwest of Greece, the palace archive includes records that have made historians skin crawl. There are tablets concerning the disposition of watchers along the coast, men posted to guard the shore. There are records that seem to describe a sudden, urgent gathering of bronze, even the bronze from temples, as though metal were being requisitioned in a hurry, perhaps to be made into weapons. There are texts that mention offerings to the gods on a scale that suggests fear, the kind of desperate piety that comes over people when the ordinary remedies have failed and only the divine is left to appeal to. The palace of Pylos was not even fortified with great walls, unlike Mycenae and Tiryns. It sat relatively open on its hill. And the tablets that record these anxious preparations, the watchers on the coast, the gathered bronze, the offerings, all come from the very last days of the palace's life. We can read them precisely because, like the tablets of Ugarit, they were baked hard and preserved by the fire that destroyed the building that held them. The watchers on the coast watched for something. We do not know if they ever saw it coming. We only know that whatever they were watching for, it arrived. Pylos burned to the ground. And it was not alone. There is something almost unbearably poignant about the Mycenaeans, because of how they were remembered. The Greeks of the classical age, the Greeks of Athens and Sparta, looked back across the long dark age that separated them from the Bronze Age and saw, dimly, through the fog of centuries, a vanished age of heroes. They believed that once, long ago, there had been men greater than themselves, demigods almost, who had walked the same land, who had built the great walls they could still see crumbling on the hilltops, who had fought a mighty war over a city across the sea. They did not know these heroes had been literate, had kept archives, had been part of an international world stretching from Egypt to the edges of the known earth. They thought of them as figures of legend, larger than life, touched by the gods. And in a way the classical Greeks were mourning something they did not understand, grieving for a golden age whose true nature had been entirely lost to them, knowing only that something great had once existed and was gone. When Homer sang of the topless towers of Troy and the bronze-clad heroes of Mycenae, he was, without knowing it, singing an elegy for the Bronze Age collapse, for a real and sophisticated civilization that had fallen so hard that even its own descendants could remember it only as a fairy tale. The palaces whose burned foundations the archaeologists now uncover were, to the later Greeks, the homes of legend. That is how complete the forgetting was. A whole civilization reduced, in the memory of its own children, to a beautiful and half-believed dream. One by one, across the Greek mainland, the great Mycenaean citadels were destroyed. Mycenae itself, the lion-guarded fortress, was sacked and burned. Tiryns, with its impossibly thick walls, fell. Across the Aegean world, the palaces went up in flames in a wave of destruction so widespread that it could not have been the work of any single rival kingdom. And here is the detail that turns the story from sad to genuinely eerie. After the palaces burned, the Mycenaean civilization did not simply rebuild on new lines. It unraveled. The whole apparatus of palace society came apart. The linear B script, the writing, was lost so completely that the Greeks would have no writing at all for some 400 years, until they learned the alphabet anew from the Phoenicians, the very alphabet that had passed down from dying Ugarit. The fine art, the gold work, the frescoes, the long-distance trade, all of it faded. The population fell dramatically. Whole regions of Greece that had been thick with towns and farms emptied out, some of them so thoroughly that archaeologists find barely any trace of human life at all for generations. People scattered. Some fled to remote islands, to Cyprus, to the coast of Asia Minor, anywhere that seemed safer than the smoking heart of the old world. The Greeks of the Bronze Age did not just lose their kings. They lost their literacy, their art, their cities, their memory of who they had been. By the time the curtain rose again, centuries later, on the Greece we think of as classical, the people living there had only the dimmest folk memory of the Golden Age before. They told stories of heroes and giants and a great war at Troy, but they had no idea that their ancestors had once written, had once kept archives, had once been part of a vast and connected world. The collapse did not just kill the Mycenaeans. It erased their understanding of themselves. And still, standing in those burned palaces, we are left with the question the watchers on the coast of Pylos must have been asking as they strained their eyes towards the sea. Who is coming? What is doing this? Because one great power had not yet fallen. One was still standing, just, and its records would give us a name for the terror, even if that name only deepens the mystery. Now we come to Egypt, and to the one place in the whole drama where someone, at last, claims to have looked the catastrophe in the eye and survived to write about it. Egypt in this period was ruled by the pharaoh Ramesses III of the 20th dynasty, a man who would be the last truly great pharaoh of the new kingdom, though he could not have known he stood at the end of an era. He had inherited a kingdom that was still mighty but already nervous, watching the troubles spread across the world to its north. And in the 8th year of his reign, somewhere around the year 1177 before our era, the storm that had broken over Ugarit and the Hittites and the Greeks finally rolled down onto the borders of Egypt itself. We know about it because Ramesses had the whole thing carved, in enormous detail, on the walls of his great mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, near Thebes. The inscriptions and the reliefs are still there today, vast scenes of battle by land and by sea, with text running alongside that describes, in the grand boastful style of pharaonic propaganda, the great enemy and the great victory. And in those carved words we find one of the most haunting passages in all of ancient history, a description, written by the people who watched it happen, of a world coming apart. The inscription tells us that the foreign lands made a conspiracy in their islands. It tells us that all at once the nations were on the move, scattered in war. It names them, a coalition of peoples sweeping down from the north and west. And then comes the line that has chilled every historian who has ever read it. No land could stand before their arms. The text goes on to list the great powers that had already fallen to this onslaught, and it reads like a roll call of the dead. It says, in effect, that the land of the Hittites was destroyed. That a whole string of kingdoms and cities, the very places we have just walked through, were cut off, wasted, swept away as if they had never been. The Egyptian scribe, carving this onto the temple wall, was not writing fiction. He was cataloguing the end of the world as his civilization had known it, naming the corpses of empires that had stood since before living memory, all of them gone in a single convulsion. And this enemy, this tide of peoples that had wiped the great kingdoms off the map, was now coming for Egypt. They came, the inscription says, with their weapons before them, and their hearts confident and trusting. They came not as a raiding party but as a migration, a whole people on the move. The reliefs show it plainly. Among the warriors in their ships and chariots there are ox carts piled high with women and children and household goods, the entire baggage of a folk that has left its homeland behind and is looking for somewhere new to live, or to die. This was not a war for plunder. This was a war for survival, fought by people who had nowhere left to go back to. And they were at the gates of the last great kingdom standing. It is worth pausing on what it must have felt like to be an Egyptian official reading the reports that came in from the north in those years. Egypt had always thought of itself as the center of the world, the eternal kingdom, the gift of the Nile, protected by deserts on either side and by the sea to the north, blessed by the gods, ruled by a living God in the form of the pharaoh. For more than 1,000 years Egypt had endured, watching other kingdoms rise and fall while it remained, the fixed point around which the world turned. And now the reports were coming in that the world to the north was on fire. The Hittites, Egypt's great rival and equal, the only power Egypt had ever truly respected, were gone. The cities of the Levant, the rich trading ports through which Egypt's commerce flowed, were burning one after another. The roads were full of refugees and raiders. And a great host of peoples, uprooted from their homes by whatever was destroying the north, was moving steadily towards the borders of the two lands. For the Egyptians, who had always believed their kingdom was eternal and divinely protected, this must have been a profound shock, a glimpse of a chaos they had thought their gods held permanently at bay. the Egyptian word for the ordered, righteous, divinely sanctioned state of the world was Maat, and the great duty of the pharaoh was to uphold Maat against the forces of chaos that always pressed in from the edges. Now those forces were not at the edges any longer. They were at the gates. And the question that hung over Egypt in the 8th year of Ramesses III was whether Maat itself could survive, whether the order of the world could be held, or whether Egypt too would be swept into the same darkness that had swallowed everyone else. Ramesses met them in 2 great battles, one on land in the region of Canaan, and one, more famously, at the mouths of the Nile, in the marshy delta where the great river spreads out to meet the sea. The naval battle of the delta is the one carved in the most vivid detail, and it is the first depiction of a sea battle in the whole of human history. The Egyptian fleet trapped the enemy ships in the narrow channels of the delta, where their open sea vessels could not maneuver. Egyptian archers lined the banks and the decks and poured arrows into the packed enemy boats. The reliefs show the chaos of it, the capsized hulls, the drowning men, the bodies in the water, the enemy warriors with their strange distinctive headdresses, some plumed like a crown of feathers, others in horned helmets, falling into the Nile under a storm of Egyptian arrows. Ramesses, the inscription declares, was like a wall of bronze. He held. Egypt held. The invasion was thrown back, the great migration broken upon the spears of the last surviving superpower. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary victory, the one moment in the whole collapse where a great civilization faced the catastrophe head-on and won. And so Egypt survived where everyone else had fallen. But, and this is the part that the triumphant temple carvings do not say, Egypt was never the same again. The victory was real, but it was the last great gasp of the new kingdom. Within a few generations, Egypt too went into a long decline, losing its empire abroad, splintering at home, its pharaohs growing weak and poor, the grand age of pyramids and conquest fading into a long twilight. Ramesses III had won the battle and still, somehow, lost the world. Because even the victors of the Bronze Age collapse came out of it diminished, smaller, poorer, frightened. He had saved Egypt. But he had not saved the age. And he had given us, in his carvings, the one thing the other ruined kingdoms never could. A name for the destroyers. He called them, among other things, the peoples of the sea. The sea peoples. The phrase has hung over this entire mystery for more than a century, a name that sounds like a solution and is in fact a doorway into deeper confusion. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. We do not really know who they were. Ramesses gives us names, a list of peoples in his coalition, strange tribal labels that scholars have spent generations trying to match to known places. Some of those names tantalize. One group has been linked, by some, to the later Greeks or to peoples of the Aegean. Another is widely believed to be the people who would go on to settle the coast of Canaan and give their name to the land of Palestine, the people the Hebrew Bible calls the Philistines. Indeed, when archaeologists dig in the old Philistine cities, they find, suddenly appearing in the layers from exactly this period, pottery and customs that look unmistakably Aegean, as though a population had arrived from the Greek world and settled down. So at least some of the sea peoples were not phantoms. They were real migrants who came from somewhere in the west or the north and ended up putting down roots in the Levant. But that only sharpens the question rather than answering it. Where did they come from? And, far more importantly, why were they on the move at all? Because you do not load your wife and your children and your last possessions onto an ox cart and sail or march across a war-torn sea looking for a new homeland unless something has gone terribly wrong with your old one. The sea peoples were not the disease. They were a symptom. They were people fleeing something, even as they became the thing that others had to flee. And to understand what they were fleeing, we have to stop looking at the swords and the ships, and start looking at the sky, and the soil, and the rain that did not fall. There is a deep puzzle buried in the Egyptian account, And it is worth lingering on, because it is the kind of puzzle that turns a simple story into a genuine mystery. Rameses tells us the names of these peoples. He carved them into stone with great care. And yet, for all his precision, we still cannot say with confidence where most of them came from. Scholars have spent more than a century arguing over these names, matching them tentatively to this place or that, to the coast of Asia Minor, to Sicily and Sardinia, to the Aegean Islands, to the shores of Greece. Some of the connections are suggestive. The people who would become the Philistines do seem to have come from the Aegean world, bringing their distinctive pottery with them. Another group's name echoes, faintly, the later name of a great Mediterranean island. But the honest position is that we're guessing, reading hints in a fog. And there is a deeper strangeness still. If these peoples came from the Aegean, from the Greek world, then they were fleeing the very same collapse that was destroying the Mycenaean palaces. They were not outsiders descending on the civilized world from beyond its edge. They were insiders, refugees from inside the system, people whose own homes had already been swallowed by the catastrophe, now washing up on the shores of the kingdoms that had not yet fallen. The destroyers and the destroyed were, in many cases, the same people, at different moments in the same unfolding disaster. The sea peoples were not a cause that came from outside the story. They were the story itself, in motion, the human face of a civilization tearing itself apart and scattering its own people across the sea like sparks blown from a collapsing fire. For a long time, the sea peoples were the whole explanation. It was a satisfying story, in its grim way. A horde of mysterious raiders, the barbarians from beyond the edge of the map, sweeping down out of nowhere to put the torch to 1,000 years of civilization. It is the kind of story we like, because it has a villain. But the more carefully scholars looked at it, the less it held together as a complete answer. For one thing, the sea peoples appear in the Egyptian records as a coalition, a mixed group of many different peoples banded together, which is not how a single conquering nation behaves. It is how refugees behave, how the desperate gather when their separate homes have all become uninhabitable. For another, the destruction was simply too vast, too simultaneous, too total to be the work of any single army, however fierce. The sea peoples could sack a city, certainly. But could they have caused the Hittites to abandon their own untaken capital in the mountains? Could they have made entire regions of Greece empty out so completely that there is barely a footprint left? Could a band of raiders, however terrible, switch off the literacy of an entire world for 4 centuries? It began to feel as though the sea peoples were not the cause of the collapse so much as one of its consequences, one wave in a much larger storm. And so historians began to look beyond the human enemies, beyond the swords and the ships, for something larger, something that could touch every kingdom at once, something that did not need an army to bring a civilization to its knees. They began to look at the weather. And what they found, written in the mud of dried-up lakes and the rings of ancient trees and the pollen buried in the soil, told a story even more frightening than the sea peoples. It told a story of a world that began, quietly and invisibly, to starve. Here is something the carved triumphs and the burned palaces cannot show you, because it leaves no smoke and breaks no walls. The climate changed. In the decades around the collapse, the eastern Mediterranean appears to have been gripped by a long, severe drought, one of the worst dry spells in the entire history of the region. We know this now in ways the people of the time never could, because the Earth keeps its own records. Scientists have drilled cores from the beds of lakes and the floor of the sea, layer upon layer of sediment laid down year by year, and trapped in those layers is the pollen of the plants that grew nearby. When you read those pollen records from the centuries around 1200 before our era, you watch a green world turn brown. The pollen of trees and crops and the lush vegetation of a well-watered land gives way to the pollen of dry scrub, of the hardy plants that survive when the rains fail. The signs come from across the whole region, from Cyprus, from the coast of Syria, from inland Anatolia, from the Greek world. A great drying, settling over the entire eastern Mediterranean at once, lasting not for a season or a year but for decades, perhaps for the better part of 2 centuries. And drought, in a Bronze Age world balanced on the harvest, is not an inconvenience. Drought is a death sentence written slowly. Think about what that drought meant on the ground, in the lives of ordinary people. These were agricultural societies. Almost everyone farmed, and the great kingdoms floated on top of the food that the farmers produced. When the rains fail year after year, the crops wither in the fields. The grain stores empty and are not refilled. The animals die for lack of fodder, or are slaughtered early, eating the future to survive the present. Famine creeps in, not as a single dramatic event but as a grinding, deepening hunger that spreads across a whole region. Remember those frantic letters from the Hittite kings, demanding ships of grain, calling it a matter of life and death. Remember the unsent plea from Ugarit, begging for grain to be sent quickly because the people were starving. These were not isolated hard years. They were the cries of kingdoms watching their food supply fail, watching their people grow desperate. And a starving population is an unstable population. People who cannot feed their children do not sit quietly and accept their fate. They migrate. They riot. They turn on their rulers, on their neighbors, on anyone with a full granary. They become, in their desperation, dangerous. The drought did not need to send an army. It only needed to make the rains fail and let human nature do the rest. And here is the terrible elegance of it. A drought does not respect borders. It does not care which king is great or which city is ancient. It settles over the whole region at once, and it strikes every kingdom in the same years, which is exactly the pattern we see in the collapse. Everyone, all at once. That is not what an army does. That is what the sky does. There is something humbling about how we came to know this, about how the earth gave up the secret that no human record could tell. The people of the Bronze Age left us thousands of clay tablets, and not one of them says, in so many words, that the rains had failed for a generation. They wrote about the symptoms, the hunger, the desperate requests for grain, but they could not, see the cause, because the cause was too slow and too vast to perceive from inside a single human lifetime. A drought that builds over decades does not announce itself. It does not arrive like an army. It creeps. 1 year is a little drier than usual, and people grumble. The next is drier still, and they begin to worry. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the good years grow rarer and the bad years more common, until what was once an occasional hardship has become the permanent condition of the land. And the people living through it adjust, and forget what normal used to be, and tell themselves that things will surely improve next year, the way people always do. They had no instruments to measure it, no records stretching back far enough to see the pattern, no way to know that they were living through one of the great climate shifts of the ancient world. It is only we, with our cores of mud and our analysis of ancient pollen and the chemistry of old seashells, who can stand outside their time and see the whole shape of the disaster that was closing in on them, the slow green death of a world that thought the rains would always come. There is a strange intimacy in that, a kind of sorrow, to know a thing about people that they could never have known about themselves, to read the cause of their suffering in evidence they could not have imagined existed. And now you can begin to see how the pieces might fit together into a single chain of catastrophe. Picture it as a sequence of falling stones, each knocking the next. First the rains fail, somewhere out at the edges, perhaps in the lands beyond the Aegean and the Black Sea, in the homelands of those peoples who would become the sea peoples. Their crops fail, their herds die, and so they do what hungry people have always done. They gather up what they can carry and they go looking for somewhere that still has food. They move south and east, towards the rich, settled, well-watered kingdoms of the Mediterranean, the lands of grain and gold. But those kingdoms are suffering too, gripped by the same drought, their own granaries running low, their own people hungry. So the migrants arrive not as guests but as a threat, a desperate mass descending on lands that have nothing to spare. And they take what they need by force, because they have no other choice and nowhere to go back to. They sack a city here, burn a palace there. And each city they destroy sends its own refugees fleeing onward, swelling the tide, so that the disaster feeds on itself, growing as it rolls. The drought creates the migration creates the war creates more refugees, and the whole thing accelerates, a cascade, a chain reaction tearing through an entire civilization. It is a far more frightening picture than a simple invasion, because there is no one to blame, no single villain to defeat, no battle that can win the day. It is a system failing under a stress that no general could fight. But even the drought, terrible as it was, may not be the whole answer. Because there is another suspect in this case, one that strikes even faster than famine, and leaves an even more dramatic mark in the ruins. Earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean sits on one of the most seismically restless pieces of the Earth's crust anywhere on the planet, a place where great tectonic plates grind against each other, where the ground itself is never entirely still. And when archaeologists examined the ruins of the cities that fell at the end of the Bronze Age, some of them began to notice things that fire and war alone do not easily explain. Walls that had toppled outward, all in the same direction, as if shoved by a single great hand. Columns lying fallen in parallel rows, like dominoes pushed over together. Skeletons crushed beneath collapsed masonry, caught in the act of fleeing, pinned where a roof or a wall came down on them. Bodies in doorways, the traditional place people shelter when the ground begins to shake. These are the signatures of earthquake, not of sword. And the timing is what makes it so striking. It appears that within a relatively short span, perhaps a few decades, a whole series of powerful earthquakes struck the region, what some scholars have called an earthquake storm, a sequence of major shocks rippling along the fault lines, one after another, as the strain in the earth released itself city by city. Imagine a kingdom already weakened by years of drought and hunger, its granaries low, its people frightened, its rulers struggling to hold things together. And then the ground heaves. The great walls that protected the citadel crack and fall. The palace, the temple, the storehouses crumble. Fires start in the wreckage and spread unchecked because there is no one left to fight them. A city that might have endured the drought, or repelled the raiders, or survived the unrest, cannot endure all three at once, with the very earth turning against it. The earthquake did not need to destroy the civilization by itself. It only needed to come at the worst possible moment, and shatter what was already cracked. And then there is rebellion, the suspect that comes not from the sea or the sky or the earth, but from within the walls. We have spoken of the palace economies, of how the great houses sat at the center of everything, owning the land, controlling the workshops, gathering in the harvest and the labor of the people and redistributing it according to the will of the king and his officials. Such a system depends on the consent, or at least the acquiescence, of the many who do the work for the benefit of the few who run it. And consent is a fragile thing when the bread runs short. Picture the situation in a Mycenaean kingdom or a Levantine city in the years of famine. The ordinary farmers and craftsmen and laborers are starving, watching their children grow thin, while the palace still demands its taxes, still calls up its soldiers, still hoards what grain remains behind its great walls. The old bargain, the unspoken agreement that the people would work and the palace would protect and provide, is breaking down, because the palace can no longer provide and can barely protect. How long does loyalty last in such conditions? How long before the hungry begin to look at the full storehouses of the elite and decide that the gods, or fate, or simple desperation, have given them permission to take what they need by force? Some scholars believe that when the enemy ships appeared off the coast, or when the earth shook the walls, the common people of these kingdoms did not always rally to the defense of their rulers. Some of them, perhaps, saw their chance. Some of them, perhaps, opened the gates, or simply stood aside, or turned on the palace themselves, settling old scores against a system that had taken everything from them and given nothing back in the hour of need. We cannot prove this happened. But the suddenness and the totality of the collapse, the way the palace systems did not merely fall but were utterly erased, never to be rebuilt, hints at something more than an external blow. It hints at a society that had lost faith in its own structure, that did not want the old order back, that let it die and walked away. The most dangerous enemy of a kingdom is not always at the gates. Sometimes it is already inside, sharpening its anger by the light of the empty hearth. So now look at how many suspects we have gathered in this one investigation. We have the sea peoples, the migrating raiders who burned cities and toppled kingdoms. We have the Great Drought, the decades-long failure of the rains that starved whole nations and set populations on the move. We have the earthquakes, the seismic storm that threw down walls already weakened by hunger and fear. And there is at least one more suspect we have barely touched, perhaps the most modern-sounding of them all, and in some ways the most disturbing, because it is the one we might most easily recognize in our own world. It is not an enemy from outside at all. It is the way the Bronze Age world was built. It is the fragility hidden inside its very success, the flaw that turned a crisis into a catastrophe. The Bronze Age was not destroyed only by what came at it from the sky and the sea and the earth. It was destroyed, in part, by what it had become. And to understand that, we have to talk about the thing that gave the whole age its name. We have to talk about bronze itself, and the long, fragile, beautiful web of trade that held the entire world together, and what happens when a web like that begins to tear. Let me explain why bronze matters so much, because it is the key to the whole fragile structure. Bronze is not a metal you dig out of the ground. It is an alloy, a mixture, made by combining copper with a smaller amount of tin. And this is the crucial point. Copper and tin almost never occur in the same place. Copper, in this world, came largely from a few great sources, above all the island of Cyprus, whose very name became bound up with the word for copper. But tin, the rarer and more essential ingredient, the magic component that turned soft copper into hard, weapon-grade bronze, came from far away, from sources that lay at the distant edges of the known world, possibly as far as Afghanistan in the east, hauled across thousands of miles by a chain of merchants and middlemen. So to make a bronze sword, or a bronze plow, or a bronze cooking pot, you needed two ingredients that came from opposite ends of the earth, brought together by an immense, intricate network of trade. The entire age, the entire civilization, ran on bronze. The weapons that armed the soldiers were bronze. The tools that worked the fields were bronze. And every single piece of it depended on that long, thin, vulnerable supply line stretching across the whole continent. The Bronze Age was, in this sense, the first truly globalized economy. And like every globalized economy that has come since, its great strength was also its great weakness. It was efficient, it was rich, it was connected. And it was utterly dependent on those connections never breaking. It is hard, from where we stand, to grasp just how extraordinary this dependence was, because we live in a world that has rediscovered it on a grander scale and learned to take it for granted. But think about it from the point of view of a single Bronze Age kingdom. To arm a soldier, you needed a sword, and to make that sword you needed bronze, and to make that bronze you needed tin, and that tin might have traveled, hand to hand, ship to ship, caravan to caravan, across the entire breadth of the known world, from mines so distant that the men who finally forged the metal had no idea where it had been dug. No single kingdom controlled the whole chain. No single king could guarantee its supply. It depended on dozens of independent actors, each pursuing their own profit, each one a link, and the whole of civilization's capacity to defend itself rested on that chain holding together. In good times this was invisible, simply the way the world worked. The tin arrived. The bronze was made. The soldiers were armed. Nobody had to think about it, any more than we think about where the components of the devices in our pockets are mined and assembled. But invisibility is not the same as safety. A dependence you cannot see is still a dependence, and perhaps a more dangerous one, because you do not guard against a weakness you have forgotten you have. The Bronze Age kingdoms had built their entire military and economic power on a foundation that stretched across the world and out of their control, and they had been doing it for so long that they had stopped seeing it as a foundation at all. It was just the floor they stood on. And nobody examines the floor until the day it gives way. We have a perfect, heartbreaking window into that world of trade, and it lies at the bottom of the sea. Off the southern coast of Turkey, near a place called Uluburun, divers found the wreck of a merchant ship that went down in this very period, near the end of the Bronze Age. And what that single ship was carrying takes the breath away. In its hold were 10 tons of copper, cast into great ingots shaped like ox hides for easy carrying, copper that almost certainly came from Cyprus. There was a ton of tin, the precious alloying metal, brought from somewhere far inland. There were hundreds of discs of raw glass, colored deep blue and turquoise. There was ebony from Africa, ivory from elephants and hippopotamuses, ostrich eggshells, exotic resins and spices, jars of olives, weapons and tools, jewelry, and trade goods that could be traced to at least 7 or 8 different cultures, from the Greek world to Egypt to the Levant to Mesopotamia and beyond. A single ship, carrying a sample of the wealth of the entire known world, all of it changing hands in one floating marketplace. That ship is the Bronze Age in miniature. It shows you, more vividly than any document, how connected this world was, how goods and metals and ideas flowed across the whole Mediterranean in a constant, humming exchange. And it shows you the dependency too. Every kingdom needed this trade. The palaces did not just enjoy the luxury goods, they relied on the system. They relied on the copper coming from Cyprus and the tin coming from the east and the grain coming from Egypt and the timber and the oil and the wine all moving along their accustomed routes. Take away the ship, take away the route, take away the trade, and the whole gleaming structure has nothing to stand on. Now imagine what happens to a world like that when the troubles begin. The drought strikes, and harvests fail, so there is less grain to trade and more mouths fighting over it. The sea peoples take to the water, and suddenly the sea, the great highway of commerce, becomes dangerous. Merchant ships that once sailed freely now risk being attacked, plundered, sunk. Pirates haunt the coasts. The land routes are no safer, with refugees and raiders and hungry populations roaming the countryside. And so, gradually, then quickly, the trade begins to dry up. The copper stops flowing reliably from Cyprus. The tin from the east, that long thin lifeline, becomes harder and harder to obtain. And here is where the specialization that had made the Bronze Age so rich becomes the thing that breaks its neck. Because in a highly specialized, interdependent economy, no one is self-sufficient. The bronzesmith cannot make bronze without imported tin. The palace cannot arm its soldiers without the bronzesmith. The farmers in one region depend on grain shipped from another in a bad year. The whole system is a chain of dependencies, and a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Cut enough of the connections, and the parts that remain cannot function on their own. A city that specialized in making one thing, trusting the network to supply everything else, suddenly finds the network gone, and itself unable to feed or arm or clothe its own people. The very efficiency that made the system so productive in good times made it brittle in bad times, with no slack, no redundancy, no ability to fall back on local self-sufficiency. The palace economies were like a house of cards built to a magnificent height. Beautiful, intricate, towering. And like a house of cards, once one section began to fall, it could not stop. The collapse of trade was not just a consequence of the troubles. It was an engine of the catastrophe in its own right, turning local disasters into a system-wide, civilization-wide failure. And the people who lived inside that system had no idea how fragile it was, right up until the moment it shattered in their hands. There is one more thread to pull, and it leads not outward to enemies and weather but inward, into the very heart of the palaces themselves. Because the Bronze Age kingdoms were not just trading economies. They were palace economies, and that is a particular and rather strange way to run a society. The palace sat at the center of everything, like a spider at the center of a web. It owned the land, or much of it. It controlled the workshops, the granaries, the storehouses. It collected the produce of the farmers and the labor of the craftsmen and redistributed it according to the will of the king and his officials. The Linear B tablets of the Mycenaeans are not poems or histories. They are inventories, ration lists, accounts of who owed what and who received what, the bookkeeping of a vast centralized operation that tracked everything down to the last sheep and the last measure of grain. This system could be remarkably efficient. It could mobilize resources, fund great building projects, maintain armies, support classes of specialists who produced nothing themselves but lived off the surplus. But it had a fatal vulnerability, the same vulnerability that haunts any system where everything depends on a single center. If the palace fails, everything fails. Cut off the head, and the whole body dies, because the body never learned to live without the head. The ordinary people had been organized, for generations, around the palace. They did not have independent markets, independent networks, independent ways of surviving without that central authority telling them what to grow and where to send it and what they would receive in return. So when the palaces burned, when the kings vanished, when the central administration that had organized everything simply ceased to exist, there was nothing underneath to catch the fall. The society did not have a layer of resilience below the palace level. It had only the void. And this may be why the collapse was so much more than a change of rulers. Kingdoms fall all the time. Dynasties are overthrown, cities are sacked, conquerors come and go. Usually, life goes on underneath. The new king moves into the old palace, the farmers keep farming, the scribes keep writing, the trade routes shift but survive. That is how most of history works, a turnover at the top while the deep structures of life carry on. But the Bronze Age collapse was different. It was not a change at the top. It was a failure of the structure itself, all the way down. The palaces did not just change hands. They ceased to exist, and the entire way of life that had grown up around them ceased with them. The writing stopped, because writing in this world was a tool of the palace administration, and with no palace there was nothing to administer and no one trained to write. The specialized crafts withered, because the specialists had depended on the redistributive system to feed them while they worked, and that system was gone. The long-distance trade evaporated, because it had been organized by the palaces and was now too dangerous and too disorganized to maintain. The art, the monumental building, the luxury, the bureaucracy, the international diplomacy, all of it had been part of a single integrated system, and when that system failed, it took everything with it. What was left, in many places, was a great forgetting. People did not gently regress to a simpler version of the old life. They fell off a cliff into something genuinely different and genuinely diminished. And the world that had taken 1,000 years to build was unmade in 2 generations. Which brings us, at last, to the hardest question of all. With so many suspects, so many forces converging at once, which one actually did it? Which one is to blame? And the answer that historians have slowly, reluctantly arrived at, is the most unsettling answer of them all. Before we weigh the verdict, it is worth understanding why this mystery has proven so stubborn, why 100 years of brilliant minds have not been able to settle it the way they have settled so many other questions about the ancient world. Part of the answer is the silence itself. The collapse destroyed precisely the things that would have explained it. The palaces that kept the records burned, and so the records stop at the very moment we most want them to continue. We have the letters leading up to the disaster, full of fear and confusion, and then nothing, because the hand that would have written the next letter was dead or fled. It is as though we are watching a film of a great house catching fire, and just as the flames take hold, the film breaks, and we are left staring at a blank screen, forever denied the ending. We have the before, and we have the long silent after, but the moment of collapse itself, the crucial hour when everything was decided, falls into a gap in the record that no amount of cleverness can entirely fill. And part of the answer is that the collapse was genuinely complicated, genuinely the product of many causes braided together, in a way that resists the simple, satisfying explanations that the human mind craves. We want a villain. We want a single cause we can point to and say, there, that is what did it. History, and especially this piece of history, rarely obliges. The Bronze Age collapse is a mystery not because we know too little, though we do know too little, but because the truth of it is irreducibly tangled, a knot of climate and migration and earthquake and economics and human desperation that no one will ever fully untie. We can describe the knot. We can name its strands. But we cannot pull out a single thread and declare it the cause, because there is no single cause. There is only the knot, and the silence, and the ash. For more than 100 years, scholars argued about the cause of the Bronze Age collapse as though it were a murder mystery with a single killer waiting to be unmasked. Was it the sea peoples? Was it the drought? Was it the earthquakes? Was it internal rebellion, the starving and oppressed masses rising up against their palace overlords? Was it the failure of trade, the snapping of the long thin lines that carried the tin and the copper and the grain? Each generation of historians had its favorite suspect, and each could marshal evidence, and each could pick holes in the others. And gradually, over the decades, a strange consensus emerged, a consensus that is really a kind of surrender to the complexity of the thing. The answer is not one of them. The answer is all of them. The Bronze Age collapse was not a single catastrophe but a convergence, a perfect storm in which many separate disasters struck the same world in the same span of years, each one feeding and amplifying the others until the whole interconnected system simply could not hold. The drought weakened the kingdoms and set the migrations in motion. The migrations brought war and refugees, and war and refugees disrupted the trade. The disruption of trade starved the specialized economies that could not survive without their imports. The earthquakes shattered cities already strained to breaking. And underneath it all, the brittle, over-specialized, over-centralized structure of the palace world had no resilience, no slack, no ability to absorb a shock, let alone 5 shocks at once. No single one of these forces would necessarily have brought down the whole civilization. Empires survive droughts. Cities recover from earthquakes. Trade routes can be re-established. Invaders can be repelled, as Egypt repelled them. But all of them, together, in the same handful of decades, hitting a system that had grown magnificent and rigid and utterly dependent on everything continuing to work, was more than any of these proud kingdoms could bear. Think for a moment about how that convergence would have felt to the people caught inside it, because this is where the cold abstraction of systems failure becomes warm and terrible and human. No one living through the collapse experienced it as a system collapse. They experienced it as a series of particular, concrete, immediate disasters, each one seemingly separate, each one demanding its own response. This year, the harvest is poor, and we tighten our belts and pray for better rain. The next year, raiders are seen off the coast, and we post watchers and send to our allies for help. The year after that, the ground shakes in the night and part of the wall comes down, and we set about rebuilding it. The grain ship that was due from Egypt does not arrive, and we wonder what has delayed it, and we ration what we have. A neighboring city, we hear, has fallen, and refugees come trickling in with frightening tales, and we take in as many as we can and worry about the rest. Each of these things, on its own, is survivable. Each has happened before, in some form, within living memory. And so the people meet each crisis as it comes, with the tools and the assumptions of the old stable world, never quite grasping that these are not separate troubles at all, that they are all symptoms of a single great unraveling, that the very ground of their world is shifting beneath them. By the time the pattern becomes clear, by the time someone might have stood up and said, "This is not a bad year, this is the end of everything we have known," it is already far too late. The collapse is not a wave you can see coming and brace against. It is a tide, rising so slowly that each individual moment seems normal, until you look up and discover that the water is at your throat and the shore is gone. There is a concept that modern scholars have borrowed to describe what happened, drawn from the science of complex systems, and once you hear it, the whole collapse comes into a terrible focus. They speak of systems collapse, the idea that a sufficiently complex and interconnected system can reach a tipping point where a series of stresses, none of them individually fatal, combine to push the whole thing past the point of recovery, into a sudden, rapid, cascading failure. The very interconnectedness that made the system strong and rich in good times becomes the channel through which catastrophe spreads in bad times. A problem in one place does not stay in one place. It travels along the connections, the trade routes, the diplomatic ties, the chains of dependency, and it becomes a problem everywhere. And complex systems, when they fail, do not fail gracefully. They do not gently wind down. They collapse, suddenly and completely, often far faster than anyone inside them could have imagined. One year the world seems normal, prosperous, eternal. A generation later it is rubble and ash and silence. The people living through the early stages of such a collapse almost never recognize what is happening, because each individual problem seems manageable: a bad harvest, a raid on the coast, a tremor in the night, a delayed shipment of tin. It is only in hindsight, only from the distance of 3,000 years, that we can see how all those separate troubles were really one trouble, how all those falling stones were really one avalanche. The scribe in Ugarit, asking what should we do, was not facing an enemy he could name and fight. He was standing inside a system that was coming apart around him, and no answer he could have received would have saved him, because the thing that was killing his world was the world itself, the whole magnificent fragile structure that everyone had assumed would last forever, finally reaching the limit of what it could withstand. And so we arrive at the silence. After the fires burned out and the dust settled and the ships stopped coming, what was left? What does the end of a world actually look like, in the years and the centuries that follow? Historians have a name for the long dark span that followed the Bronze Age collapse. They call it a dark age, and in the case of Greece especially, the name is earned. For something like 400 years, the lights were out across much of the old world. The great cities lay abandoned or shrunken to villages. The art of writing was forgotten across vast regions, so that for centuries there are no documents at all, no letters, no records, no accounts, nothing but the mute testimony of broken pots and burned foundations and the bones in the soil. The population had crashed. Some regions lost the majority of their people, to famine, to violence, to flight. The grand international world of brother kings and humming trade routes and the constant exchange of goods and letters across the whole Mediterranean was simply gone, replaced by a fragmented, isolated, impoverished patchwork of small communities scratching a living from the land, knowing little and caring little about anything beyond the next valley. The skills of the old world withered. The monumental architecture stopped, because there were no longer the centralized resources or the specialized labor to raise great buildings. The fine crafts declined. Standards of living fell. People who had once lived in cities that traded with the ends of the earth now lived in huts, made do with what they could produce locally, and forgot, slowly, that the wider world had ever existed. It was a contraction so severe and so prolonged that it amounts, in human terms, to one of the greatest regressions in all of history. A civilization did not just fall. It was forgotten by its own descendants. It is worth dwelling, for a moment, on what was truly lost in that long darkness, because the loss was not only of buildings and kings and wealth. It was a loss of knowledge, of skill, of accumulated human achievement that had taken centuries to build and would take centuries to rebuild. Think of the craftsmen, the men and women who had spent their lives mastering the making of fine things, the goldsmiths who could work a sheet of gold into the face of a god, the potters who could throw a vessel of impossible delicacy, the scribes who could hold 7 languages in their heads, the engineers who could raise walls of stone that would stand for thousands of years. When the system that supported them collapsed, that knowledge did not transfer to anyone else. It simply died with them, unrecorded, untaught, because there was no longer anyone with the leisure or the resources to learn it, and no longer any market for what it produced. A skill that exists only in the hands and minds of living people is a fragile thing. It survives only as long as there are masters to practice it and apprentices to learn it and a society wealthy enough to want it. Break that chain for even a single generation and the skill is gone, perhaps forever, and must be painfully reinvented from nothing by people who do not even know it once existed. The Bronze Age collapse broke 1,000 such chains. The fine arts, the writing, the engineering, the diplomacy, the bookkeeping, the whole inheritance of a civilization, much of it simply vanished, not destroyed in fire but allowed to lapse, to be forgotten, to slip out of the world because there was no longer anyone able to carry it. That is the quietest and perhaps the saddest part of any collapse. Not the dramatic burning of the palace, but the slow, silent forgetting of all the things that the palace had made possible. But here is the thing about the end of a world. It is also, always, the beginning of another. The Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was not the end of human civilization. It was a long, hard, painful pause, a winter that lasted centuries, and out of that winter, eventually, new things grew, things that could only have grown in the space cleared by the catastrophe. The old palace civilizations, for all their splendor, had been rigid, centralized, controlled from the top, with the masses of ordinary people locked into systems that organized their lives down to the last measure of grain. When those systems collapsed, they did not just take the splendor with them. They also took the rigidity. And into the cleared ground, slowly, over generations, came something new. Consider iron. The Bronze Age, by its very name, was the age of bronze, and bronze, as we have seen, depended on that long fragile supply line of tin from the ends of the earth. When the trade routes collapsed and the tin stopped flowing, the old way of making weapons and tools simply failed. But necessity is a hard teacher. Iron ore, unlike tin, was relatively common, found in many places, available locally. And in the centuries after the collapse, people across the old world learned, out of need, to work iron, to smelt it and forge it into tools and weapons that no longer depended on imports from 1,000 miles away. The Iron Age that followed was, in a sense, a direct child of the collapse, a world that had learned to make do with what it had at home, freed from its dependence on that fragile global web. The catastrophe that destroyed the Bronze Age was also the labor that gave birth to the age that came after. And there is the alphabet, that small, world-changing thing we have already met, born among the busy merchants of Ugarit. When the great cities fell and the complex scripts of the palace bureaucracies, the cuneiform and the linear B, were forgotten along with the bureaucracies that used them, something simpler and tougher survived in the cracks. The alphabet, that streamlined handful of signs that ordinary traders could learn and use, did not need a palace or a school of professional scribes to keep it alive. It was carried on, especially by the Phoenicians, the great seafaring traders of the Levant who emerged in the wake of the collapse, sailing the Mediterranean and spreading their goods and their letters wherever they went. And it was from the Phoenicians that the Greeks, centuries later, learned to write again, taking that alphabet and adding vowels to it and making it their own. Every letter on this page, every book ever printed in a Western language, descends from that alphabet that survived the death of the Bronze Age, that slipped through the catastrophe in the hands of merchants and sailors while the grand civilizations that despised such humble practicalities burned. The collapse destroyed the mighty and preserved the modest, and the modest thing it preserved turned out to be one of the most powerful tools humanity has ever possessed. And think, too, of the Phoenicians, who deserve more than a passing mention, because they are among the truest heirs of the lost world. They were the descendants of the same Canaanite coastal culture that had produced Ugarit, the merchant cities of the Levantine shore. And where the great palace kingdoms had perished, these traders survived, precisely because they were not built on the rigid, centralized, top-heavy model that had proven so fatal. The Phoenicians were nimble, decentralized, mercantile, organized around independent cities and the daring of individual merchants rather than around a single all-controlling palace. When the old world fell, they did not fall with it. They adapted. They took to the sea in greater numbers than ever, filling the vacuum left by the collapse of the old trade networks, sailing further and bolder than anyone before them, eventually reaching the far western end of the Mediterranean and beyond, founding colonies, spreading their goods and their letters across the whole known world. They carried the alphabet with them, that humble invention of the practical merchant mind, and planted it everywhere they went, so that when civilization rose again, it rose with the gift of easy writing already in its hands. The Phoenicians are proof of one of the deepest lessons the collapse has to teach. It was not the mighty who survived. It was not the great kingdoms with their towering walls and their golden palaces and their armies of chariots. It was the flexible, the adaptable, the decentralized, the ones who did not have so far to fall and who could bend without breaking. The age of the great Bronze Age empires ended, and the people who inherited the world that came after were not their conquerors but their humble trading neighbors, who had quietly built their lives on a foundation that the catastrophe could not so easily sweep away. Look, too, at what grew on the cleared ground in the centuries that followed, because the children of the collapse include some of the most consequential cultures in all of human history. In the highlands of Canaan, in the unsettled aftermath, among the displaced and the migrating and the dispossessed, a people coalesced who would call themselves Israel, a people whose religious and literary traditions would shape the spiritual life of half the world for the next 3,000 years. The very disruption of the old Canaanite city-state order, the weakening of the Egyptian grip on the region, the movement of peoples like the Philistines into the coastal lands, all of it helped to create the conditions in which this new people could emerge and find their identity in the hill country. And in Greece, after the long dark age, after the centuries of forgetting, something extraordinary happened. The Greeks did not simply rebuild the old Mycenaean world. They built something entirely new, something the Bronze Age had never imagined. Out of the small, isolated, scrappy communities of the Dark Age grew the city-states of classical Greece, with their wild new experiments in politics and thought, their democracy and philosophy and drama and science, the civilization of Athens and Sparta, of Socrates and Plato, of the ideas that still underpinned so much of how we think and live today. None of that could have existed in the rigid, palace-centered, top-down world of the Bronze Age. It needed the catastrophe to clear the way. It needed the old order to be swept off the board entirely, so that something genuinely different could be invented in the empty space. The Greeks even kept a memory of the world that fell, dim and transfigured into legend, in the great poems of Homer, the tale of the war at Troy, the heroes of Golden Mycenae. They no longer understood that this was the memory of a real and literate and connected civilization. They thought it was a tale of gods and giants and a vanished age of heroes. But in a way they were right. It was a vanished age. And they were its descendants, building something new on its grave. And consider Cyprus, the great island of copper, which we have mentioned but not yet truly visited, because Cyprus tells the story of the collapse in its own particular way. For most of the Bronze Age, Cyprus had been one of the luckiest places in the world. It sat in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, a stepping stone between the great powers, and beneath its soil lay the copper that the whole civilized world craved. The island grew rich beyond its size, its towns swelling into something like cities, its harbors busy with the ships of every nation, its smiths turning out the ingots that armed and equipped the kingdoms all around. To live on Cyprus in those years was to live at the crossroads of the world, prosperous, connected, important far beyond what a single island should have been. And then the collapse came for Cyprus too. The towns were destroyed, some of them more than once, burned and rebuilt and burned again, as if the island were being struck by wave after wave of disaster. The trade that had made it rich faltered as the kingdoms it sold to fell silent one by one. And yet Cyprus is also a place where we can see the strange resilience that runs alongside the ruin, because even as the old order collapsed, refugees from the falling Aegean world washed up on its shores and settled there, bringing their language and their customs, mingling with the people already present, beginning the long process out of which a new Cypriot culture, Greek-speaking, would eventually emerge. The island that had thrived as a node in the old network did not simply die when the network died. It was wounded, diminished, transformed, but it endured, and it became something new, a refuge and a meeting place for the scattered survivors of a drowned world. Cyprus is the collapse in miniature, all of it together, the ruin and the survival, the death of the old and the slow painful birth of the new, written on a single island in the middle of the dying sea. So what are we to make of it all, this end of the ancient world, this catastrophe that swallowed empires and erased the memory of itself? Stand back from it now and look at the whole shape of the thing, 3,000 years on. A world that thought itself permanent, that had stood for a millennium, that was rich and learned and connected and proud, came apart in the space of 2 generations, not because of any single enemy or disaster, but because it had grown so complex and so interdependent and so fragile that when many troubles came at once, the drought and the migrations and the earthquakes and the failing trade and the brittle, top-heavy structure of its own success, there was nothing left to hold it up. The mightiest kingdoms on earth, the Hittites who had fought Egypt to a standstill, the Mycenaeans behind their giant walls, the ancient trading cities like Ugarit that had stood for 2,000 years, all of them gone, their palaces burned, their writing forgotten, their people scattered or starved or fled. And the most haunting thing of all is how little warning they seem to have had, how completely the people living through it failed to grasp what was happening to them, until they were writing their last desperate letters and posting watchers on the coast and gathering the bronze from their own temples, asking, in the end, the only question left to ask. What should we do? There was no answer. There is, perhaps, a kind of warning in that for any age that believes itself too connected, too sophisticated, too advanced to fall. The Bronze Age believed that too. It was, by the standards of its time, the most advanced and interconnected civilization the world had ever produced. And it discovered, too late, that the very things that made it great, its complexity, its connections, its dependence on a vast and intricate system all working together, were also the things that made it mortal. But I do not want to leave you only with the ash and the silence, because that is not the whole of the story, and it is not the truest part of it. Yes, a world ended. Yes, the cities burned and the kings vanished and the writing stopped and the memory faded into legend. But something always survives the fire. That is the deepest lesson of the Bronze Age collapse, and it is the one I find myself returning to in the quiet hours. Out of the ruins of that lost world came the iron that would arm new kingdoms, and the alphabet that would teach the world to write again, and the peoples whose ideas and beliefs and inventions would shape everything that followed. The scribe in Ugarit pressed his last words into the clay and the clay survived, hardened by the very fire that destroyed his city, carrying his voice across 3,000 years to be read by you, tonight. He thought he was writing a letter that would not be sent. He was, without knowing it, writing a message to the future, a message that said, simply, we were here. We built something. It mattered. And it is gone now, but you, whoever you are, you remember. That is what the embers are. Not the fire that destroyed, but the small warm light that remains after the fire has passed, the light by which the next world finds its way. Every civilization that has ever risen has eventually fallen, and ours will too, one day, in some way we cannot foresee. But nothing is ever entirely lost. The embers carry forward. The alphabet survives the palace. The story outlives the storyteller. And somewhere in the ash of every ending, the seeds of a new beginning are already, quietly, waiting for the rain. If these forgotten worlds and the stories pressed into their ruins are the kind of thing that keeps you company in the dark, then stay a while longer with us, because there are 100 more lost cities waiting in the embers, 100 more civilizations that rose and fell and left their voices behind in stone and clay and ash. We gather them here, one by one, the ancient mysteries and the vanished kingdoms and the secrets the old world left behind, and we tell them softly, the way the old stories were always meant to be told, late at night, by someone who remembers. So if you would like to keep these embered histories burning, and to be here when the next lost world is brought back into the light, then settle in, breathe slow, and let the fire keep you company a little longer. The next story is already waiting. And in the embered histories, nothing is ever truly forgotten. The Aztecs were wrong about the gods. The city was built by humans. It was built fast. The first significant construction at Teotihuacan dates to about 150 before Christ. The first phase of the Great Pyramid of the Sun was raised around 100 after Christ. Within a single century, the city expanded from a small ceremonial center into the largest urban site in the Western Hemisphere, at its peak around 400 after Christ, with a population of somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people. That made it, at that moment, one of the half-dozen largest cities in the world. It was bigger than contemporary Rome. It was bigger than contemporary Constantinople. It was much bigger than any other city in the Americas. It was also, by the standards of the time and place, anomalous. The other great civilizations of Mesoamerica, the Maya in the south, the Zapotec in Oaxaca, the various Gulf Coast cultures, built their monumental architecture around the king. Maya temples have carved royal portraits. Zapotec tombs have royal inscriptions. Every major Maya city, almost without exception, has a list of its kings preserved on a stela or a doorway lintel. Teotihuacan does not. In 150 years of excavation, no one has ever found a single royal portrait at Teotihuacan. No king's name. No royal tomb. No carved succession sequence. No depiction of any individual ruler at all. What the city has, instead, is gods. Endless gods. The feathered serpent. The rain god, Tlaloc. The maize god. The fire god. The flayed god. Dozens of named or unnamed supernatural figures, in murals on apartment block walls, on painted ceramics, in stone reliefs at the temples. And it has the avenue. The straight processional road, 2.5 kilometers long, that runs north from a smaller pyramid at the south end to the foot of the Pyramid of the Moon at the north. The avenue is laid out at an angle of 15 degrees east of true north. Every building in the city is aligned to it. So is the layout of the apartment blocks. So are the underground tunnels. So is the orientation of the city's water management system. The Spanish called the avenue, when they first saw it, the Calzada de los Muertos. The Avenue of the Dead. They thought, as the Aztecs had, that the long row of platforms running down both sides of it were tombs. They were not tombs. They were temples. But the name stuck. In the year 2003, a Mexican archaeologist called Sergio Gómez Chavez was clearing rainwater drainage at the small plaza in front of the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, the third great pyramid of the city, at the southern end of the avenue. He noticed that water was disappearing into a sinkhole at the foot of the temple. He sent a small remote-controlled camera down through the sinkhole. The camera reached the bottom of the hole and kept going. It traveled forward, level, into a long horizontal passage. Gómez had found a tunnel. It had been dug under the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, almost certainly by the original Teotihuacan builders, around the year 100 after Christ. It ran due east for 103 meters. It ended in a three-chambered crypt directly beneath the apex of the pyramid above. The tunnel had been deliberately sealed in the 2nd century after Christ. The Teotihuacanos had blocked it with stone, plastered over the seal, and built the pyramid over it. Gomez's team spent the next 14 years excavating it. What they found, between 2003 and 2017, was extraordinary even by the standards of Mesoamerican archaeology. The tunnel walls had been embedded with thousands of pieces of polished iron pyrite. The deliberate effect, by torchlight, was the illusion of walking under a starry sky. The floor had been strewn with mercury, in liquid form, applied to mirror the underworld water. The 3 chambers at the end contained more than 70,000 individual objects. Jade beads from the Maya lowlands, 800 kilometers south. Pyrite mirrors. Carved wooden masks. Liquid amber. Sculpted blocks of green stone. For small figures of black volcanic rock, arranged as if seated around an altar. Hundreds of large rubber balls. Animal offerings, ocelots, eagles, snakes, all sacrificed and arranged in geometric patterns on the chamber floors. There was no royal tomb. There was no body. What Gomez had found was a shrine of the founding generation of Teotihuacan, sealed under the pyramid by the people who built it, and left as a sacred deposit to ensure the cosmic order of the city above. It was, in some respects, the closest thing the city has produced to a foundation document. But it is not a written one. The Teotihuacanos did not write. We have, from the entire 700-year history of the city, no readable inscription of any kind. Around the middle of the 6th century after Christ, somebody, or something, burnt the center of Teotihuacan to the ground. The destruction was selective. The 2 great pyramids were not destroyed. The apartment blocks where ordinary people lived were not destroyed. But the central religious and administrative core, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, the platforms along the avenue, the rich residential complexes that were almost certainly the homes of the priestly and ruling elite, were burnt simultaneously, in a single coordinated action, with great ceremony. The statues of the gods were smashed. The murals were defaced. It does not look like an invasion. There is no evidence of a foreign army. There are no broken weapons in the rubble. The ordinary population went on living in the apartment blocks for at least another century after the burning. It looks, instead, like a revolution. Or an organized desacralization. The priests and the ruling class were attacked, in their own ceremonial buildings, by people who had a clear ideological reason for going after the religion and not the houses. By around 600 after Christ, the city's population had collapsed. The avenue was abandoned. The apartment blocks were emptied. The valley emptied out in waves over the next century. The cause is not known. The favored modern theories, drought, internal class conflict, religious schism, ecological exhaustion, are all consistent with the evidence. None of them is decisive. By the time the Aztecs walked in, 800 years later, the empty city had already passed through several owners. The Toltecs had prayed at the pyramids. Smaller, scattered communities had built shrines on the periphery. Hunters had crossed the avenue in pursuit of deer. The forest had grown over the southern half of the site. The Aztecs found a city of overgrown plazas with 2 enormous pyramids standing above the trees. They climbed the larger one. They named it. The name has stuck for 600 years. When the Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagun was compiling, in the middle of the 16th century, what would become his great 12-volume Encyclopedia of Pre-Hispanic Mexico, he interviewed a large number of Aztec elders. He asked them, among many other things, what they knew about the founding of Teotihuacan. He got the same answer, repeated almost word for word, from speaker after speaker. The gods met there. The gods deliberated there. The gods decided, there, who would die and rise as the next sun. One of the gods, a sick, poor god, with sores all over his face, threw himself into a great fire in the central plaza. He came back up as the sun. Another god, more beautiful, threw himself in after him. He came back up as the moon. The other gods waited until the new sun rose, and then they followed him into the fire as well, so that the sun would have the strength to keep moving. The place where the gods made themselves into the sun and the moon is called Teotihuacan. What the Aztec elders were describing was, almost certainly, the great central ritual of the city in its living period, 800 years before. The fire ceremony at the new dawn. The self-sacrifice of the priests. The ordering of the cosmos by deliberate human action. The Aztecs had not witnessed it. They had only seen the empty stage on which it had been performed. But the story had survived. It had passed, somehow, through 800 years of intermediate cultures, picked up by villagers and pilgrims and minor priests, and arrived in the mouths of Aztec elders sitting in a Franciscan convent under Spanish guard, in the language they had inherited from the survivors of the city. They got the meaning right. They got the dates wrong by 9 centuries. The dates are still wrong, in some respects, today. The exact founders are still unknown. The exact reasons for the founding are still unknown. The language the Teotihuacano spoke at home, after a working day in the apartment block, is still unknown. What we know is what the Aztecs knew. There is an empty city in the valley. It is enormous. It is older than anything any living tradition can remember. And once, in the central plaza, somebody threw themselves into a fire to keep the sun moving. If this is the kind of patient story you like to fall asleep with, an empty city the gods were said to have built, 2 pyramids older than memory, and a tunnel of pyrite stars beneath the feathered serpent, there are dozens more on this channel. Every night, another piece of the ancient world the centuries did not quite manage to bury. Hit subscribe, and the next one will be waiting. To understand the search for the tomb of Genghis Khan, it helps to understand what kind of tomb the people who buried him would have built. Genghis Khan was, by birth, a steppe nomad. His people did not build pyramids. They did not build mausolea. They did not build stone monuments of any kind. A steppe lord, in the Mongol tradition of the 12th and 13th centuries, was buried in a deep pit, with his weapons, his favorite horse, occasionally with a wife or a concubine, and with grave goods proportional to his rank. The pit was filled in. The soil was carefully replaced. The grass was allowed to grow back. If the lord was particularly important, a sacred enclosure, an Chinchorro, was declared around the grave site. Entry was forbidden to anyone except a small caste of guardian families, called the Darkhad, whose hereditary task was to keep the site secret and protect it from desecration. In the case of Genghis Khan, the enclosure was the entire massif of Burkhan Khaldan, a chain of forested mountains roughly 200 kilometers long, sacred to the Mongol royal line, and forbidden to ordinary travelers for the next 400 years. The Darkhad existed continuously, as a sworn hereditary order, from the day of Genghis's burial until the early 20th century. They patrolled the borders of the Chinchorro. They reported to the Mongol Khans, and after the Khans, to the Manchu Qing emperors, who continued to honor the prohibition. The last hereditary Darkhad commander died in 1926. The Soviet government, which by then controlled Mongolia, abolished the order entirely and tried, several times, to find out what they had been guarding. The Darkhad's secret, by then, was no longer fully known even to themselves. They knew which mountains were forbidden. They did not, by the early 20th century, know the precise valley. In 1928, a Russian-led expedition under the geologist Dmitry Bukinich entered the area for the first time. They mapped the river systems. They took core samples of the soil. They identified a number of suspicious mounds that might have been ancient tombs. None of them, when opened, contained anything of significance. In 1962, a larger Soviet-Mongolian team revisited the area. They opened 12 more mounds. They found medieval Mongol burials, animal sacrifices, scattered weapon caches, and one well-preserved felt tent. They found nothing that could plausibly be the burial of Genghis Khan. The most striking result of the Soviet work was negative. The team mapped, with care, the location of every visible disturbance in the Sacred Valley. They found that the entire interior of the Burkhan-Khaldan Massif, an area of roughly 12,000 square kilometers, was almost completely free of human disturbance. The forest had grown undisturbed for at least 800 years. The river courses had not been engineered. There were no roads. There were no agricultural terraces. The Darkhad had done their job. The grave was, almost certainly, inside the massif somewhere. The Soviets could not narrow the location further. In 1990, after Mongolia became independent of Soviet influence, the question reopened. In 2008, an American scientist called Albert U. Minot Lin at the University of California in San Diego launched a project called Valley of the Khans. Lin was a computational engineer. His specialty was applying high-resolution satellite imagery and crowdsourced visual analysis to large-scale archaeological survey. The Mongolian government had granted him permission to use commercial satellite imagery, chiefly QuickBird and WorldViews 1, with sub-meter resolution, to map the entire surface of the Sacred Valley without ever entering it. Lin and his team subdivided the satellite imagery into roughly 3 million small tiles. They then asked online volunteers, tens of thousands of them, across 2 years, to flag any tile that contained an unusual feature. Linear disturbances, mounded shapes, unnatural geometric patterns, anything that looked artificial. The volunteers flagged roughly 55,000 candidate features. Lin's team then triaged them. They cross-referenced each candidate against ground-penetrating radar surveys that they conducted in the field, wherever they were permitted to enter the Chinchorro. They eliminated geological features. They eliminated modern disturbances. They eliminated medieval roads, animal carcasses, and the marks of 19th-century goat herders. By 2012, the project had identified 55 high-priority candidates within the Chinchorro. It had not opened any of them. The Mongolian Ministry of Culture had given Lin permission to survey, not to excavate. The question of whether the grave should be opened at all is a contested one in modern Mongolian politics. The Mongol Buddhist establishment opposes any excavation of the sacred site. The Mongolian nationalist movement opposes any excavation that could disturb the bones of the national founder. The descendants of the Darkhad, who were rehabilitated in the 1990s as a recognized cultural group, oppose excavation absolutely. Lin's data sits in a sealed archive at UC San Diego. He has refused to publish the exact coordinates of any candidate site. He has refused to allow the data to be used by any tomb hunting expedition. He has said, in interviews, that he does not want the tomb to be found in his lifetime. The interest in Genghis Khan's tomb is partly archaeological. The tomb of a 13th-century Mongol emperor would almost certainly contain a remarkable quantity of Central Asian and Chinese diplomatic gifts, military trophies, gold and silver in bullion form, and possibly written records, perhaps including the original of the Secret History of the Mongols, the long-verse chronicle of Genghis's life that survives today only in a Chinese transcription made decades after his death. But the interest is also financial. Several private expeditions have, over the years, claimed to be close to locating the grave. A Japanese-Mongolian joint expedition in the late 1990s opened a series of pits along a riverbed in the Chinchorro. They were stopped by lightning storms. The local Buddhist interpretation was that the spirit of Genghis Khan had personally objected, and by an outpouring of protest from Mongolian villagers and politicians. The expedition was suspended. The Japanese sponsor lost a considerable amount of money. The pits were carefully filled in by Mongolian officials. 2 American treasure hunting expeditions in the 2000s were turned back at the border for permit violations. A French-led expedition was permitted to do non-invasive radar work in 2010 on the condition that no result would be published without the consent of the Mongolian Ministry of Culture. No result was published. The tomb stays where it is. In the secret history of the Mongols, the only contemporary Mongolian account of Genghis's life, written by a member of his court within a generation of his death, there is a single passage that describes the moment when the young Temujan, not yet calling himself Genghis Khan, first climbed the mountain of Burkhan Khaldan. He was about 13 years old. He had just escaped, on foot, from a group of raiders who had killed his father and tried to kill him. He spent 3 days alone on the mountain. On the 3rd day, he came down and prayed. He said, "Burkhan Khaldan has saved my life. Henceforth, every dawn I shall pray to it, every evening I shall pray to it, and my descendants and the descendants of my descendants shall remember it." 58 years later, when he gave the order for his burial in the chosen valley, he was returning to the mountain that had saved his life when he had nothing. The valley where he is buried, somewhere within 12,000 square kilometers of forested mountains in northeastern Mongolia, is almost certainly the one he climbed as a 13-year-old boy fleeing on foot. The tree he prayed under, or one descended from it, is almost certainly still standing somewhere on the mountain. It has not been disturbed in 8 centuries. It is possible that it never will be. If this is the kind of patient story you like to fall asleep with, a steppe boy who became the world conqueror, 1,000 horses ridden over an unmarked grave, and a mountain that has guarded one man for 800 years, there are dozens more on this channel. Every night, another piece of the ancient world the centuries did not quite manage to bury. Hit subscribe, and the next one will be waiting. The Chinchorro people lived along a 200-kilometer strip of coastline that runs from the modern Chilean city of Arica north into what is now southern Peru. It is one of the driest places on the planet. The Atacama Desert behind it has not, in recorded geological time, received a single significant rainfall. Some weather stations near the coast have registered measurable precipitation only twice in the entire 20th century. The Chinchorro survived there because the cold Humboldt Current runs north along that coast from Antarctica, bringing up cold nutrient-rich water that supports one of the densest concentrations of fish, shellfish, and sea mammals anywhere in the Pacific. Where the desert touches the sea, the desert is rich. The Chinchorro never had to leave the beach. They lived in small camps of reed huts on the dunes above the high tide line. They fished with harpoons made from sharpened bone and cactus thorn. They gathered mussels. They hunted seals. They made nets out of plaited cactus fiber and wove conical baskets out of reeds. They did not farm. They did not, for the 7,000 years their culture lasted, develop pottery. What they developed instead, with a patience that no other culture of their level of technology ever matched, was a system for keeping the dead. The first Chinchorro mummies came out of the ground in 1917, when a German archaeologist called Max Uli was excavating a small shell midden on the outskirts of Arica. Uli had been digging in the Andes for 30 years. He had excavated at Teotihuacan and Pachacamac. He thought he knew what to expect in a coastal shell midden. He expected, perhaps, a few bone tools, a stone harpoon head, the bones of fish and seals, the ordinary residue of a fishing camp. Instead, in a single small trench on the beach at Playa Miller, he found 2 intact bundles wrapped in vegetable fiber. He unwrapped them carefully. Inside were 2 children. They had been completely disassembled and reassembled. Their bodies had been packed with grass and sea reeds. Their skin had been stitched back over them. Their faces had been covered with clay masks, painted black. Yuli radiocarbon dated them, decades later, at 5,050 years before the present. He had no idea what culture had made them. The local Aymara villagers had no tradition of anything like it. There was no record of a coastal civilization in any of the Spanish chronicles. The nearest comparable mummies, from the desert highlands at Paracas in Peru, were 3,000 years younger. For the next 40 years, the Chinchorro mummies were treated as an isolated curiosity. A few more were found, by chance, in shore excavations. They were boxed up and sent to museums in Arica and Santiago. A handful went to the British Museum and the Smithsonian. Most of them were stored in plywood crates with their wrappings still on. Then, in 1983, a flash flood hit the city of Arica. Arica is built on a series of low marine terraces above the modern shoreline. In the heavy El Niño of 1983, a freak rainfall, perhaps the only significant rainfall the city had seen in 15 years, washed out the soft surface of a hillside on the south edge of town. The hillside was, it turned out, a Chinchorro cemetery. The flood exposed 96 bodies in a single afternoon. A small team from the University of Tarapacá, led by the Chilean physical anthropologist Marvin Allison and his student Bernardo Arioza, was at the site within a day. What they found, over the next 6 weeks of emergency excavation, transformed the understanding of the culture. The bodies had been buried in distinct phases. The oldest were what Arioza later called the black mummies, the disassemble and reassemble technique that Yuli had first seen. The black paint was a manganese-based pigment that hardened over the clay mask into a glossy lacquer. The skin was stitched together with cactus fiber thread. The internal cavity was packed with ash, grass, and small pieces of llama or seal pelt. A wooden stick, sharpened at both ends, was driven up through the spinal column to keep the rebuilt body rigid. The face was modeled in clay over the original skull. The black mummies were the oldest, beginning around 5,000 before Christ. They continued, by Arioza's count, for about 2,000 years. Then the style changed. The red mummies began appearing around 3,000 before Christ. The technique was simpler. The internal organs were removed through small incisions in the abdomen and at the base of the skull. The skin was largely left in place. The body cavity was packed with vegetable fiber, then sewn shut. The face was painted bright red with hematite. The hair, sometimes thickened with a kind of black resin, was left in its original arrangement. After the red mummies came the bandaged mummies, in which the body was wrapped in long strips of vegetable cloth. After the bandaged mummies came the mud-coated mummies, in which the corpse was simply painted with a thin slip of clay and left to dry. Then, around 2000 before Christ, the practice stopped. The last Chinchorro graves contain only unprocessed skeletons. The mummification techniques, black, red, bandaged, mud-coated, had been used for almost 3,500 years. Then, sometime during the late 3rd millennium, the culture stopped making them. No one knows why. For decades after Yuli's discovery, the standard assumption was that the Chinchorro mummies were a royal or religious privilege, that some small caste of priests or chieftains had been preserved while everyone else had been buried as ordinary skeletons. The flood-uncovered cemetery of 1983 broke that assumption. The 96 mummies from the Arica hillside included men, women, children, infants, and stillborn babies. They came from every age group present in the population. They appeared to come from every social position. Roughly 30% of all the bodies recovered from Chinchorro contexts of the same period turned out to be mummified. Children, in particular, were disproportionately represented in the earliest phase. Many of the black mummies are of infants and stillborns. Some are of fetuses recovered, almost certainly, from miscarriages. In a population whose infant mortality must have been very high, perhaps 50% of all live births, the Chinchorro had developed a technology and a ritual for keeping the bodies of their lost children intact. It is the first practice of its kind in the human record. It also seems to have been, in a way the Egyptians never quite achieved, democratic. The Chinchorro did not preserve only their kings. They had no kings. They preserved everybody who mattered enough to anyone to be preserved. In 2004, a Chilean radiologist named Vivian Standen ran high-resolution CT scans on 20 of the Aurica mummies. She was looking for evidence of arteriosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries that 19th-century pathologists had assumed was a disease of modern life. She found it. Several of the Chinchorro mummies had advanced atherosclerotic plaques in their aortas. They had been eating, apparently, enough seal blubber and oily fish to have raised their cholesterol to clinically significant levels 7,000 years ago. But that was not the most interesting thing she found. In the chest cavity of one of the youngest mummies, a girl of perhaps 3 or 4, classified as black mummy type, from around 4,500 before Christ, Standen found a small object that was not part of the original reassembly. It was a single dried sprig of a coastal flowering plant called Nolana. The flowers were still attached. The petals were still recognizable as 5 small white and violet bells. Someone had laid the flowers on the chest of the rebuilt child before stitching the skin closed. The petals had been there for 6,500 years. The Chinchorro left no temples. They left no writing. They left almost no tools. What they left was the body of a small girl with a sprig of desert flowers tucked under her ribs, sealed there by hands that did not know that anyone would ever look inside. If this is the kind of patient story you like to fall asleep with, a coastline of fishermen, the oldest mummies in the world, and a child with flowers under her skin, there are dozens more on this channel. Every night, another piece of the ancient world the centuries did not quite manage to bury. Hit subscribe, and the next one will be waiting. Commagene was a small kingdom that should not have existed. It sat at the bend of the upper Euphrates, on what is now the southeastern border of Turkey with Syria. To its north was the great mountain plateau of Armenia. To its east was the Parthian Empire of Iran. To its south and west was the slowly expanding Roman Empire. For 200 years, Commagene held a thin strip of arable river valley between 3 powers that could have crushed it on any given morning. It was 150 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide. Its capital, Samosata, sat on the Euphrates itself. It survived by being small enough not to matter and clever enough not to provoke. Its kings were descended, on the male line, from a Persian aristocrat who had served Darius the Great, and on the female line from Alexander the Great's general Seleucus. The royal house spoke Greek at court, Aramaic in the bazaar, and Persian at the temples. Its religion was an elaborate blend of Greek, Iranian, and Anatolian gods, fused into a single-state cult that no other kingdom shared. For 2 centuries, this small mongrel state did very well. Its kings married into the Parthian royal family and the Seleucid royal family. They paid lip service to Rome when it was useful. They charged a quiet customs duty on every caravan that crossed the Euphrates between Ansh and Ctesiphon. They built temples. They minted coins. They left, in their archives at Samosata, a clear administrative record of a small Hellenistic kingdom getting on with the business of being prosperous. Antiochus I was their greatest king. He was also the one who decided, around 62 before Christ, that his tomb would be on top of the highest mountain in his kingdom. Mount Nemrut, Nemrut Dagay in modern Turkish, was the highest peak in the Commagene Massif. From its summit you can see, on a clear day, 300 kilometers in every direction. Anchisus's engineers took 20 years to prepare the site. They flattened the natural summit. They quarried the broken limestone of the mountain itself and heaped 50,000 tons of it into an artificial cone on the cleared platform. The cone was 50 meters high and 150 meters across at the base. Around the base, 3 terraces were cut into the bedrock, one on the east side, one on the west, one on the north. Each terrace was 100 meters long. On the east terrace, facing the rising sun, a row of 9 seated colossi was carved from local sandstone. From left to right they were a lion, an eagle, Anchisus himself, the goddess Commagene Fortuna, Zeus Oromastes, Apollo Mithras Alios Hermes, Heracles Artanes Ars, and a second lion and eagle at the far end. Each figure was 8 to 9 meters tall, seated on a throne, hands resting on the knees. The faces were carved from a separate block and fitted to the top of the body by an iron pin sealed into the neck. On the west terrace, facing the setting sun, the same 9 colossi were carved again, in the same order. On the north terrace, between the east and west colossi, a long sandstone wall carried bas-reliefs of Anchisus's ancestors. There were 17 Persian ancestors on one side, 15 Greek ancestors on the other. They were carved in profile, in the formal style of the late Hellenistic East, each labeled with a name in Greek and a small genealogical inscription explaining his descent from Darius or from Alexander. Behind every colossus there was a long Greek inscription. They have all survived. They were carved into the back of each throne in 7-centimeter letters. They are, in effect, Anchisus's last will and testament, the nomos of Commagene, the royal foundation document for the cult of his own tomb. The inscription tells us, with great clarity, what he wanted to happen on this mountain after his death. The nomos of Mount Nemrut, carved sometime in the early 30s before Christ, is the longest royal inscription that survives from any Hellenistic kingdom. It begins with Anchisus's titles. Great King, son of King Mithridates Callinicos and of Queen Laodice, divine, just, brother of the sun and moon and Jupiter, descendant of Darius and of Alexander. It then lays out, in 22 paragraphs, exactly how he wishes his memorial to be administered. 2 priests are to be installed at the Hierothesion, the sacred precinct around the tomb. They are to be Greeks on the male side and Persians on the female side. They are to wear Persian robes. They are to perform sacrifices on his birthday, the 16th of the month Ordneos, and on the day of his coronation. They are to feast the entire population of the 4 nearest villages on these days. They are to play music. They are to allow no one to remove a single stone from the mountain. The cult is to be perpetual. The land around the mountain is given, by royal decree, in perpetuity to the priesthood. The proceeds of the villages are to fund the sacrifices in perpetuity. The names of the priests are to be inherited father to son in perpetuity. The mountain, and the king beneath it, are to be remembered forever. The cult lasted, on the best modern estimate, about 20 years. Anchisus died, of unknown causes, around 32 before Christ. The Romans absorbed Commagene as a province in 17 after Christ. The cult of the king on the mountain was not, by then, a Roman priority. The villagers stopped feasting on the king's birthday. The priests faded out. The mountain stayed standing because no one bothered to take it apart. The 8 enormous heads stayed where they had been sculpted, watching the empty sky, for the next 300 years. Then, around the 4th century after Christ, an earthquake shook the limestone summit. The colossi cracked at the neck, exactly where the iron pin held the head to the body. The heads fell forward onto the terrace. The bodies stayed seated on their thrones. They have lain like that ever since. In the early 20th century, a few European travelers visited Mount Nemrut. The German engineer Karl Sister had reported the site in 1881. A Berlin expedition under Otto Puchstein had surveyed it in 1883. They had drawn the heads, photographed the terraces, and concluded that the king's body was almost certainly somewhere beneath the artificial cone, but that to dig through 50,000 tons of loose limestone in search of him was, with the available technology, impossible. For 60 years, no one tried. Then, in 1953, an American art historian called Teresa Goel arrived in Samsat at the foot of the mountain with 78 pieces of luggage and an introduction from the Bollingen Foundation. She was 48 years old. She was nearly deaf from a childhood illness. She had lost her husband and her young son in separate tragedies a few years earlier. She had decided, very deliberately, that the rest of her life would be Mount Nemrut. She went up the mountain every summer for the next 23 years. She mapped every stone of the east and west terraces. She catalogued every fragment of every colossus. She lifted the heads. She measured the inscriptions. She found, in the rubble at the foot of the artificial cone, the remains of a third colossal head that had been overlooked by the German survey. She built a careful, photogrammetric, three-dimensional reconstruction of the entire site as it would have looked in Anchises' own lifetime. She also tried, 3 separate seasons, to find the burial chamber. She drilled core samples through the artificial cone. She used the earliest available seismic equipment to map subsurface voids. She negotiated, year after year, with the Turkish Ministry of Culture for permission to dig a horizontal tunnel into the base of the mound. She got the permits twice. Both times the tunnel collapsed before it had penetrated more than 10 meters into the unstable limestone. She did not find the chamber. She died in 1985, in a nursing home in Maryland. Her ashes, according to her own request, were sent back to Mount Nemrut. They were scattered, in a small private ceremony, on the East Terrace, at the feet of the seated colossus of the king. Today, Mount Nemrut is a Turkish national park and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The artificial cone is still there. The 8 enormous heads still lie on the terraces. The Greek inscriptions are still legible. A small visitor center at the base of the mountain shows a model of the Hierothesian as it would have looked when the colossi were standing. A long zigzag path of cut stone steps climbs to the summit, where on most days of the summer season a few dozen tourists come up just before sunset to watch the light change on the limestone. The burial chamber has never been found. Modern ground-penetrating radar, run across the cone in 2010, indicated a probable chamber roughly 20 meters below the summit. Modern Turkish law forbids any excavation that would disturb the artificial cone. There it sits, a king, almost certainly, beneath 50,000 tons of broken stone, with the gods and the ancestors arranged around him in 2 rows of sandstone giants who are quietly weathering into dust. It is, almost certainly, the most over-engineered tomb that any Hellenistic monarch ever built. It is also, beyond reasonable doubt, the one that has worked. Among the inscriptions on the back of the throne of the king, on the East Terrace, is a single sentence that does not appear on any of the other thrones. It reads, in Greek, "I have prepared this seat for myself, while still alive, for the eternity that I shall have to come." He was, when he wrote that, in his middle 50s. He had been on the throne of Commagene for nearly 30 years. He had outlived his father, his older brothers, and most of his children. He had watched the Roman civil wars from a safe distance, and made the small careful calculations that had kept his kingdom alive. He had walked up the mountain himself, at least once, to inspect the work. The colossi were seated, when he saw them. The heads were on the bodies. The view was the same one his own visitors had not yet been born to see. The view that the 8 detached heads have been looking at, 1600 years after the earthquake, without a face but with their eyes turned east. If this is the kind of patient story you like to fall asleep with, a king on a mountain, his 8 enormous faces lying in the rubble, his body still beneath the stone he ordered piled on top of him, there are dozens more on this channel. Every night, another piece of the ancient world the centuries did not quite manage to bury. Hit subscribe, and the next one will be waiting.